So it's my pleasure to introduce Matt Mills and Katia Asche, partners in the DC office and New York office, respectively. They're both co-leaders of the Consumer Product Industry Group at Arent Fox Schiff. And this panel, you might, if you were a Jeopardy fan, you might say this is kind of a hodgepodge, right? What does greenwashing and PFAS have in common? But they actually have a common thread. And that is the threat and implementation of government regulation and the threat of private litigation and actions. Matt is a specialist in our IP group, specializing in advertising claims, and Katia is a specialist and very savvy litigator in our products liability group. So, with that said, we're going to start with Matt, actually. Greenwashing claims and regulations continue to trouble the industry. In fact, this year, the EU implemented the Greenwashing Directive. So this is an area that has been active and will continue to be active. Can you tell us the 2 or 3 or 4 things that you think are really troubling to this group?
Great, thanks, Michelle. So Michelle termed it greenwashing, but we're going to switch that up a little bit. We're talking about it in the context of what I like to call aspirational advertising or feel-good advertising. We all know that consumers are attracted to products that they feel like are good for themselves, good for the environment. So we're going to break this into 2 categories, really. The first are claims that relate to kind of overall health and wellness, and claims that appear to have a social or environmental impact. So examples of those are, we're seeing in the industry a lot of claims called clean claims. So you'll see, if you go to Sephora, you go to a large cosmetics company, they say, we've got clean ingredients, clean formulas. You also see claims such as ethically sourced or sustainably sourced. You see things such as ethically obtained. So one of the things we're going to look at first are these clean claims. So one of the things that we run into a lot is, what does clean really mean? I like to say that clean is the new natural. If you remember several years ago, everybody called their products were naturally sourced. Well, lots of things have naturally sourced. Petroleum is naturally sourced, but we don't necessarily want to put it on our face or on our food products. So the companies that have been getting in trouble, so one example is Sephora was sued in a class action for being clean at Sephora. Another company that got sued was another cosmetics company that actually got challenged by the NAD, which is a competitive advertising bureau run by the Better Business Bureau. They said they had clean ingredients and clean formulas. So Sephora actually was able to get out of their class action, was supporting the claim, because what they had done is every time they had clean at Sephora, they defined what did that mean for them. So they had a list of 4 to 5 specific ingredients that were commonly used in cosmetics that they had taken out of their products. At the NAD, their claim was clean ingredients and clean formulas. And then they followed it under it with a disclosure that they had removed over 2,000 ingredients from their products. So they actually had to modify that claim. They were able to support the clean ingredients and clean formulas, but the area that they had to tweak was their disclosure. They did disclose what these 2,000 ingredients were. You could click on a link. It took you to a giant PDF that said, here's all the things. Well, the problem was, of those 2,000, around 1,800 of those had never been put in cosmetics. They were like, there were all these things that people would never expect there. So the NAD said, you can continue to make your claim, but you really just need to tweak it and show what you're excluding that are commonly featured in cosmetics. So the takeaway from, if you want to make these claims related to health and wellness, if it relates to clean, make sure to define for the consumer what that means. Give them a separate website, give a disclosure for that, and also make sure that it's consumer relevant. That if you're saying you've removed 2,000, make sure those are actually cosmetic ingredients. The second kind of claim we want to talk about are these kind of globally sustainable, eco-friendly, ethically sourced. So there's a lot of companies that have been getting in trouble for those. Some in the food industry, there are a lot of coffee, chocolate companies that have been advertising their products as being ethically sourced, sustainably sourced. But when they have been sued and they start examining kind of the labor practices or where those products are originating, it actually comes out that somebody in marketing decided these were good things to put on the chocolate bar, but they actually are not able to support it on the back end. The second thing we're seeing a lot of are ethically sourced as it relates to clothing. So Canada Goose has been sued once, a couple times maybe, for the sourcing of the fur collars on their coats. So they had a very long disclosure on their website about where their fur is sourced from and how they make sure that everything they get is sustainably and ethically sourced from the fur trappers. But the issue was the places they were sourcing it from, allowed what are called like open leg traps, the way they trap the animals. So even though they said we're complying with the local regulations, everything is up to par, when you really drill down on how it's sourced, it was very hard for them to support that their clothing is being ethically sourced. They did end up settling that suit privately, one of them, so it's unclear what they had to pay out to the plaintiffs in that. But one of the things you want to really examine on the corporate side it's very, people want to make these aspirational messages. We're reducing our carbon footprint by this much, or reducing the amount of water consumed. And people think, well, those don't really mean anything to the consumer. I mean, they're important, but they're not advertising. But we like to say aspirational is advertising. People are buying your products because you're saying we're reducing the amount of water, they're reducing the amount of energy consumed with that. And that is really a selling point. So you do have to view that as advertising. And in some of the cases we're seeing, the courts have been asking, well, what have you done to obtain and meet these goals that you've been putting forth? So, if you review your corporate responsibility websites, see what you're doing to actually get to the next step. As Michelle mentioned, there is a growing number of jurisdictions where they're really looking at clothing waste. The EU passed a law where you're not allowed to just destroy extra products or products at the end of the season. They're really pushing that. There is an interest group in the US that's pushing for a federal ban that would do the same thing that's been done in the EU. We're starting to see that locally. For instance, Massachusetts recently banned where you cannot dispose of clothing and footwear in their landfills. And last week, there's been a bill pending in California that had been passed, where in California, if you sell textiles, apparel, that they're going to make the clothing companies, the textile companies, pay in to a fund to establish the statewide initiative to recycle, reuse, and repair. And the article came out last week, and then over the weekend, Governor Newsom actually signed that. So that will be put into place with an expected date of 2028, where you're going to have set places in California that you have to go. You can go take your old jeans, and then the clothing companies have to pay in to figure out what do we do with these. So it is an increasing area of exposure. So it's definitely one of the hot topics.
Can I ask you a quick question, Matt? So you talked about ethically sourced being one of the hot aspirational claims. How far back in the supply chain do you really have to look to make sure that you're in compliance with that?
It is all the way back to the source. So in some of the food companies that I mentioned, they were advertising that their coffee beans and their tea leaves were 100% ethically sourced. And they went back, and they were these investigative journalists who went back and saw that in the fields where they're doing, they had terrible fertilizer runoff. So it was not just, you think of the classic where it's not ethically sourced because it's unfair labor or forced labor, but they're doing so much more than that. They're talking about like runoff, water consumption, the clear cutting of the fields, especially in rainforest jurisdictions. So, when you're thinking about it, don't just say, well, we have a supplier agreement in place that says they don't use child labor. You really need to go the next step and see, are they telling us the truth?
Okay, so now we're going to move on to Katia. Just a little preview. So no segment of the cosmetics or fashion industry right now is safe from scrutiny over PFAS, and those are forever chemicals. I'm not going to even attempt to do the chemical name. I'll leave that to Katia. And they can be found in so many products, from fabric finishes to mascara, you name it. Anything that's waterproof or wrinkle-proof might have PFAS in them. So the textile industry is really under attack right now. What are you worried about as a litigator on this issue?
Thanks, Michelle. So PFAS, Per and polyfluoral alkyl substances, also known as forever chemicals, because they don't break down easily in the environment, and they don't break down easily or break down quickly in your bodies, are a class of over 10,000 chemicals that have been used since probably the 1940s to make products slick, water repellent, durable, stain-proof, anti-wrinkle, you name it. These substances are truly in everything. If you have a plastic, it's in there. So what are we seeing in terms of the regulatory landscape? And I'll just touch on this briefly because my colleague Lynn is going to go into it in more detail a little later. There has been a ballooning of legislation across states and in the federal government that is aiming to either ban PFAS in products or require companies that put PFAS into their products to disclose that to the government. I saw a statistic the other day that said something on the order of more than 400 bills were pending before states' legislatures in 2024 alone. Okay, so this is going to spread across the country before you can say the word per and polyfluoral alcohol substances. From a litigation standpoint, I think the consensus amongst the defense bar is that this could be the next mass tort like asbestos or talc. What's a mass tort? It's not a delicious pastry, I can tell you that much, okay? Mass tort, you need two things to make that. You need a critical mass of consumers who are exposed to a product. So the thing with asbestos was that it was manufactured with everything, right? Everybody was exposed to asbestos. And the other ingredient to a mass tort, even though it's not a pastry, is a signature disease. So you need a disease that it is known is only caused by this product or substance. So for asbestos, it was mesothelioma. For talc, it was relatedly ovarian cancer. And then you get to this place where the plaintiff's bar recognizes an opportunity to make a lot of money. And when I talk about the plaintiff's bar, I truly am talking about a group of plaintiff's attorneys across the country who are very well connected with each other, who have extraordinary resources, who are, are in the pockets and in the ears of states' legislatures and the federal government. And they are coming together to find the next asbestos litigation, because guess what? Asbestos litigation is a dying industry for them. Historically, mass torts like asbestos litigation can bankrupt companies. It's a game ender, right? Right now, the science isn't there. There's no signature disease associated with PFAS. The EPA and various scientists agree that there is a correlation between certain conditions and PFAS, high cholesterol, thyroid disease, some cancers, but correlation is not causation. And without that signature disease, it's very difficult to establish this mass tort. So we're not there. I should also note that the exposure mechanism for PFAS is, right now, it's known only to be through ingestion, right? So you're not necessarily getting PFAS poisoning from your shoes right now. Companies that make things that can be ingested, like lipsticks or certain skincare products, should be a little bit more concerned. But the pathway for exposure right now is purely ingestion. So what are plaintiffs' attorneys doing with PFAS if they can't get at the moneymaker right now? They're picking off the low-hanging fruit. The low-hanging fruit are class actions that are claiming your product. Hey, look, I picked your product off the shelf. I went and got it independently tested. It has PFAS. Your label doesn't say it has PFAS. Give me my money back. Right? Or I wouldn't have paid $3.50 for your product had I known it had PFAS. I would have paid $3, so give me my 50 cents back. 50 cents obviously is not a threatening amount of money, but if you multiply it by your 1 million consumer base, it becomes more troublesome. So what can companies do to mitigate this exposure? I think for the PFAS labeling claims, the false advertising, the misleading advertising claims, it's pretty simple. You go out, you get your product tested. You know, right? You know if you're putting PFAS in your product for specific use, if you're making rainwear or stain-resistant clothing, you know you're using PFAS. But you may not know if you're not intentionally adding PFAS. You know the ingredients or the substrates of your products, but you don't know what your suppliers are putting in there. And even if you think you know what your suppliers are putting in there, they could be switching it up on you. So go get the products tested, know what's in them, and then you have to make basically a business decision about how you're going to label the products. Nobody wants to plaster a product with warning labels saying that it's going to give you cancer, right? Because that's not good marketing. But you have to balance the risk of not giving your consumers full disclosure against the risk of litigation. And that's going to vary, right? That analysis is going to vary from company to company.
And where are you suggesting that companies do the testing? In the U.S. or in the place of manufacture?
That's a great question, Michelle. So most products that are manufactured overseas will have testing done where they're manufactured, and the manufacturers will give you a certificate of compliance or conformity, whatever it is, depending on the particular standard or hazard that's being tested. And largely those are reliable, but we have seen pushback in litigation against testing that comes out of places like China as not being reliable. And even if it is reliable when you first put the product out, right, because you're going to do this testing before you even go to production, again, your supply chain, something could be tinkered with in the supply chain, and it changes the makeup of the product. So it behooves you to test frequently, and it behooves you to try to get it audited in the United States, I think. Yeah. In terms of mass tort mitigation, it's kind of another ballgame, because the exposure that is going to give rise to mass torts lawsuits of the future has already happened. You can't undo it. Because it's sort of a slow burn to disease from exposure, and it's probably dose dependent. Like, you have to be using the product for X number of years. Certainly with asbestos and mesothelioma and talc and ovarian cancer, it was decades in some cases. So there's nothing you can do about that. What you can do now to mitigate your exposure going forward is, if your products have PFAS, get out ahead of the bans and phase those out of your products now. And that gives rise to what is known as a state-of-the-art defense, right? Look, we were ahead of the statutes banning this stuff. We did the best we could with the knowledge we had at the time. The other thing you can do, and this really depends on your exposure level, your risk level, if you really do have PFAS in your products that are intentionally there, if you have products that are likely to be ingested, and if you have the resources, if your company is large enough to do this, is you can get out ahead of the science. The plaintiffs' lawyers right now, they are working with toxicologists, they are working with epidemiologists, they are trying to develop the causation science so that they can go make their money. And large companies that have real PFAS exposure risk on the mass tort front can do the same thing. You can get your toxicologist, you can get your epidemiologist. Look, there's only a handful of these scientists out there who are qualified and credible and able to do this work. And you want them working for you early if this is going to be a problem for your company. You can commission those studies and get that done. Obviously, that depends on a number of different kinds of factors, but that's what you can do.
That's a great suggestion, Katia, in terms of getting ahead of hiring those experts. I don't want to squander your expertise only on PFAS, and it's a huge area. Any other products liability issues, hot button issues that you're seeing and facing with your fashion and cosmetics clients?
Yeah. So look, if you make a product that people are wearing, I'm sure you're familiar with a claim that the product gave me a rash or I have skin irritation. In some cases, it can be more severe than others. You can have scarring. There's a number of things that you can do to mitigate your exposure to litigation. This is classic textbook product liability litigation. Your product injured me. It's not a mass tort. Number one, you want to make sure that your product is obviously tested to meet or exceed all of the applicable national and international safety standards. You want to make sure that your product is adequately labeled with known allergens. And you want to make sure that when you are getting these claims, and depending on the number of claims that you're getting, you have a process and a system in place to investigate them and a strategy for how you're going to resolve or defend those claims. In 2022, there was federal legislation passed called MOCRA. Many of you are probably familiar with that and dreading it. MOCRA is going to, little by little, codify these best practices that I just spoke about. So you're going to be required as a cosmetic manufacturer, as a fragrance manufacturer, to label your product with a list of known allergens. You're going to be required to disclose to the government serious adverse reactions to your product. But that doesn't mean that you should necessarily wait until those regulations come into effect, because they're not in effect yet, to do these things. Certainly in terms of allergens, there is a pretty decent, though not a silver bullet defense to say when somebody comes to you and says, I'm allergic to nickel, and I had an allergic reaction to your product, I had blistering, I now have a scar, you can point to your product and say the instructions or the manual or the label says it has nickel in it, right?
Excellent. And we are running out of time, so I want to make sure we open it up to questions. Does anyone have any questions for either Matt or Katia? If not, I'll have my own. Oh, you have one? Go ahead.
In regards to the PFAS legislation, is that state by state or is that national?
It's both. It's both. So the EPA has its own set of legislation around this. It just sort of walked back the effective date by, I think, like 6 months or something like that. The EPA is going to be focused on environmental pollution. It seems like the state legislation is more focused on disclosure of the PFAS in your products and also banning products. I mean, New York, in 2025, New York is going to ban PFAS in apparel, period. But yeah, it's state by state. I think there's 3 states that have active legislation right now, and it's clearly sweeping across them.
Any other questions? Yes.
Thank you. What about on the retail distributor side? Are you seeing any movements or any particular positions around any of the topics that either of you have discussed?
In terms of PFAS,
Could be
or
PFAS, could be greenwashing.
Well,
speaking.
So everything that affects manufacturers affects retailers, and retailers can protect themselves with their contracts with their manufacturers, right? And make sure you have some good indemnification clauses in there. But sort of generally, broadly speaking, if there is legislation or regulations that mandate something for manufacturers, it applies with equal measure to retailers and distributors. Yeah.
Anyone else? I have a question for you, Matt. So we're in an election year. Patriotism is at an all-time high, and made in the USA claims are probably bubbling up a lot on products as they had been for a while, but they took a nap and now they're back again. Why don't you talk to us a little bit about made in the USA claims?
Yep. So in 30 seconds, I'm sure, being in the apparel industry, you're very familiar with the labeling required for any of the textile products. But just always keep in mind, people always think like, as long as I don't say made in the USA, if I'm advertising, if I put patriotic images, I put the seal, the flag, I'm going to get out of that. So just, anytime you start seeing kind of, patriotic indicia, anything like that, just look behind that. We are seeing a lot of claims where people are starting to add that on there, and that's pulling them into made in USA, because somebody sees, the eagle, the flag, or something like that, they think, well, this must be made in America. They don't look the next step. So just always keep an eye out for that.
Thank you very much. Thank you to our panel. Appreciate it.